Hello friends, today we are going to discuss about promises in JavaScript. In my previous video, I've given an introduction what is promise and how we can access and use promise and few fundamental concepts. Today mostly we'll deal with how we can work with multiple promises. If you see in my screen, I've defined three instances of three promises, P1, P2 and P3. And there are various other functionality available in promise object. For example, all settled, any and race. So I'll try to explain and demystify what exactly each functionality mean and where you can use it. There are various examples I'll give. Theoretically I'll discuss and show the code examples, how their behavior in the runtime. So in the first use case, all the three promises is resolving to some success value. Resolve means all are successful. Reject means there leads to error. So whenever the promise is successful, then the result will come in the then block. If the promise is rejected or failed, then the result will come into the catch block. But what the variable, can we join multiple promises and execute in parallelly? That's what we are going to discuss today. So all the promises will be used for executing them in a combined fashion and try to aggregate the result at one point and deals with that. So starting with all, inside as an argument you can give an array and you can give the instances of promises P1, P2, P3. And when all execution successful, then this block will be executed. And one important aspect to remember here is that this result will contain an array. This is not a single value. This array will contain the value of individual promises. If you try to print it, it will come as an array fashion and each corresponding entry will contain that corresponding promises value. In this simple example, it is string, but they can be complicated. Like for example, this may be another array, or this may be an object, or this may be a number, depending upon what promises resolve that value. But important aspect to remember is that this particular response is the result, and this will be only executed once. This then won't be called again and again. This is the aggregation of the result of all the three promises. This particular all is commonly used. Wherever you want to aggregate, you want to parallelly run multiple promise to make some HTTP call or REST API call and get the result and try to do operation once everything complete. Then all settled. I'll go to the failure scenario one by one. I don't want to jump the gun, so I'll explain the failure scenario also in few minutes. But now only focus on how they'll all behave in successful scenario. All promises are successful. This all settled is also similar to all. This response is also an array. So instead of directly value, for example like P1, P2, P3, it has a additional wrapper. So which contain two fields. One is status. Status can be fulfilled or rejected, or value is the actual value. So in this case, most of this all successful or failure scenario, then the then block only will be executed. For all settled, this catch block won't get executed at all. And this status is very helpful for actually knowing like each promises whether it is success or failure. So this particular is a container of the status as well as the value. So this is one of my favorite function which is recently introduced, and this is I feel more comfortable to use it. So now we understood all and all settled. Both this response is of array type. That is the important aspect. So it will contain the aggregate result. In the right hand side I explained like any and race. So any and race slightly differ from this all. Now let's see one by one. Any. So any promises resolved or all rejected. So if there are three promises P1, P2, P3, in our case all resolved to success value. Then this is printing the first entry which is successful first one, P1. Even though this is rejected and if it is P2 is resolved, then it will return the P2 and so on. So any promises resolved, then this particular thing will be executed. If all three will be rejected, then only this catch block will be, executed. So if you are given like 5 promises, if one promise is, successful, then this block will be executed on that. A multiple will successful, then the first entry will be, this response will contain the first value, only P1. So in our example, all 3 promises is successful, but this response will only refer to the P1. This is this first one, okay? And rest also kind of similar to any. In this particular case, this also return to one value data, P1. So what is the difference between any and arrays? In this particular use case, where all 3 are successful, both are outputting the same value, but it is at most crucial to understand the differences. This particular, arrays is only looking at the first of the promises. So it is not in the order. This is in this particular example I given in a order, resolve P1, P2, P3 to make the example simplify. But in this real world example, you may want to call HTTP call or file handle call. So this P1 may come later and P2, there is no guarantee that P1, P2, P3 will come in a order. So whichever resolve first, so this race will always look in the first promises, whichever resolve. So if that is resolved, then this, if it is successful, then this will be executed. If it detects the first entry, if it is failed, then this will be catch will be thrown. So even though there are 2 entries successful and first entry failed, then it will be coming as a failure one. But without jumping the gun, in case of successful behavior, because this is the first one, P1, then this is the P1 would be returned. And any also P1 will be written. And one point again I want to stress it out. This is a simple example. I am not making an HTTP call or file handling call. That's why this P1, P2, P3 will be executed in a sequential manner. But in a real world scenario, if you are trying to make HTTP call, so this P1 can execute later and P3 may come fast. So whichever is the first, that is important aspect. Okay. Now let me show some example. The same code, let me execute it. Running in one shot will give more, confidence to understand the differences. So I define like 3 instances of P1, P2, P3. All 3 are resolving. So all are successful, P1, P2, P3. Then I'm using all settled, res and any. I don't have any finally statement. Just then and catch. So this time all will execute this then block because everything is successful. This catch won't be executed for anything. So let's see what is the value we are getting. Okay, this promise any is not a function. That means this any function is because I'm running the node runtime. If you see this, node by default node version is 14. So if you use the latest one 16, this any will be resolved. Let me switch to 16 one. So promise any is complaining in the node version 14. So I'm using a NVM. This is a package manager which you can use for managing the different version. So NVM U16 will switch my node version to the latest one, latest stable one. So version 16. If you do this node version, it is the 16 version I'm using. Now let me execute it. So if you see this all, This is returning a array P1, P2, P3. These three are not promise name, but actually the data what we written over here. P1, P2, P3. And all settled is returning an array, but this is an internal representation object. So it is returning a status value, fulfilled. Then race is P1, N is P1. Both are single value, but both are same at this moment. I'll show where they differ, but for this usual scenario, race and any are exactly same data they are returning. Because race will be looking to the first promise, whether it is successful or failed. Any you will see anything is successful or failed. But in this case, both are, P1. Now let me show another scenario. In the previous, we have seen all successful or all resolve. This example we will see all three promise reject. So all three of them are rejected. In this case, all the then block won't get executed and this catch will be executed. But this particular thing, I don't like it. Why they made design in such a manner? In case of catch error, or this error is not an array. So there is no way you can know that P2, P3 is failed. All of them are failed. So in our example, all of them are failed. But it is difficult to know that what about happened to P2, P3, right? So in case out of this P1, P2, P3, even though this P2, P3 is successful, if one of this particular promise failed, then the first one it will catch and throw the error, and this error will contain this data. So this is a bit confusing to know. Out of all three, if one of them is failed, in our case all three failed, so it is looking into the first entry. So P1, it is printing the message. It is not giving the error message of P2 and P3. It's all settled. That is the reason I like it. So it given the status of all three. And it is not going to this case block. This data is coming into the then block only. And this response is an array. And if you see status, rejected, then inside this then block, you can put some if else condition. If it is rejected, do some error handling, otherwise continue. So this is more cleaner approach to get all this status of all three promises. And this any promises, this time this any and this thing will behave slightly differently. Because this any, this is an important aspect. If out of P1, P2, P3, because none of them have failed, so it will go to the catch block. And this error is like, a kind of error value. It won't fail or it won't crash the program, but it will throw an aggregate error that you can access using the error and you can handle it. But it won't give that error message what P1, P2, P3 supplied. This particular P1, P2, P3 value, you cannot access under this catch block. It will only show this aggregate error, all promises were rejected. But it is not exactly showing that which message it rejected on. And this particular aggregate error only come in this scenario, while all the P1, P2, P3 are rejected. If one of them is successful, then block will be executed. This is what any block, any function will do. Because in this case, all three are rejected, all promises are rejected, so this error will come. And this error will come inside an array. I don't know why they put an array. But this error which is type of is array, and inside that we have like aggregate error, all promises were rejected. And if you notice over here, like race condition, this race condition is always looking into the first entry, first promises. And again I am telling this in this simple example, my P1 is my first, but if you do a simulate, if you're running three P1, P2, P3, they're making HTTP call, the first one may not be the first. So whichever the request is coming as the response faster, response HTTP, that will be treated as a first promise. So in this case, P1 is rejected. So this then block won't execute, and catch block will be executed. And this would be contain the data. Error will contain the P1 value. So it will be always looking for the first of the promise, the rest condition, rest function. It will ignore the P2 and P3. Even if they are successful or failed, it doesn't bother about it. Okay, just to summarize, all if one of them are failed, in this case 3 of them are failed, but it will error will be catch block will be executed, and this error will contain the first entry, in this case P1. So you can't access this rejection value of P2 and P3. This all settled, I like it, because there is a simple catch. This catch block won't get executed. Whether it is success or failed, this then block will be executed. In this case, you can see the status rejected all of 3 and P1, P2, P3. And if all promises are rejected, then this aggregate error will be thrown. So you cannot access this whatever this rejection data P1, P2, P3 or error message you cannot access. Only you get a generic message. And this race condition is only interested into the P1 in our example. So if it is failed, then this catch block will be executed, the first one, and it will ignore the P2 and P3. Even the P2, P3 fail, it doesn't bother about checking into the P2 and P3. Now let's see that example in a code. So I make 3 of them rejected. So all settled. And if you see the order also not coming, there is no guarantee that all will execute fast and all settle. They can execute in a different order as well. So all settle with status and reason. Status is like, if you see this is the value, this is the reason. You should be careful into accessing the data. Because in case of fail, you should always look into the reason. If it is successful, you should look into the value. There is a slight difference on that. And if all, it is the first entry P1, and race is the first entry P1. And any, it would be see aggregate error. Aggregate error, all promises were rejected. This is a bit important to know the difference. Now move to the next use case. I've explained 2 use cases now. One, all are success. Second, all are rejected. Now let's see different behavior. The first one is success and other 2 are failed. In case of all, if one of them are failed, so this catch block will be executed. And in our case, P2 and P3 both failed. So the first it will pick and show the message like P2. So it will ignore P3. But it won't execute, even though the P1 is successful, this won't be executed. So all will be always fail if one of the promises fail. And all settle will return an array, status and value. And I think this is the reason. There is a typo mistake here. So this status is fulfilled and value is P1. And in case of fail, you can see status and reason. Now let's see about this any. In our example, this P1 is resolved. Both are failed. So it doesn't bother like a failed scenario. If one of them promises fail, P1 is successful, then this then block will be executed. It will check if one is pass, any is successful, then it will execute that particular value. Then block will be thing. Then this race will always check the first one. In our case, the first one P1 is successful, then the block will be executed and P1 will be printed. In this case, again, like any and race behave the exactly same. Now let's see that example in quickly. So the first one we want to make it successful. All settled. First one is fulfilled, P1, and rejected with the reason. If you notice, this is the value is for success and failure is for reason. And race and any, both P1 they will only print, both are printing the success value, the result. There is no failure or catch condition won't get executed. But in case of any, in case of all, it then won't be executed. This will go to the error path or catch block. Then it will execute the P2, the first failure, this one. Okay. Now the last example. The first I rejected and other two are resolved. If you see that other example, both looking similar, but first I resolve, second two are rejected. But in this case, I was rejecting the first one and resolving other two. Then let's see what will behave. This all, like as I said, if one of them is failed, which in our case P1 is failed, so that then it will go to the catch block and this P1 will be printed. All settled. The status, and again this is like reason, status and reason for error, and status and value for the successful scenario. And this any, it should check with which one is successful. This P2 is successful because the P1 is failed, it doesn't bother about it. It will see P2 is successful, then it will print P2. Then this race will always see the first one, P1 is successful or failed. In our case P1 is failed, then this catch will be executed. P1 is failed. Race is always looking the first one. Now let me do that. First one reject. Second two resolve. So this all settle is really nice. It gives status and reason. Status is rejected and P1 is whatever the value. This any, if any of them are successful, then it will be returning that. In this case P2 is successful, then it will print P2. Then it is successful one. All also will fail. If one of them are failing, this all will be printing that one. In this case P1 is failed, so it will print P1. It will ignore the successful one. If all success, then only it will return an array. If one of them fail, then it will fail the scenario. Then this error race. If the first one is failed, then it will it will only go to the error path and it will show the failure path. So that is all for today. So I hope you understood the differences between all settled, any and race. So have a good day ahead. Bye bye.